Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at Airplane.
Oh, Airplane.
One of the funniest, I think, comedies ever made.
For sure. Classic.
It's interesting because this one came from a listener submission, and they actually sent us a whole podcast episode dedicated to Airplane.
That's dedication.
So that's what we're going to be using today to kind of guide our deep dive into this film.
I love it. A fan's perspective. That's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Airplane hit theaters back in 1980, and this podcast, it really dives into how this movie kind of, changed the game for parody films.
Right.
But it wasn't just about making fun of things. It really went all in on the absurdity.
Yeah.
And it was delivered with, like, totally straight faces. Like, how does that work so well?
Well, it's really fascinating. This podcast points out that the filmmakers, the Zucker brothers and Jim Abrahams, they were huge fans of the disaster movies that they were parodying, especially 0 Hour, which was a film from 1957.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So they were drawing specifically from 0 Hour.
Exactly. They took plot points, familiar elements from 0 Hour.
Yeah.
Like the troubled airplane, the pilot who seems way too calm.
Right.
And that unexpected hero that has to save the day.
Yeah.
And then they just cranked up the absurdity to 11. So it's this hilarious homage to the films that it's also making fun of.
Oh, that's really interesting. So this podcast also spends a lot of time talking about the cast and how they really bring this humor to life. And obviously we've got Robert Hayes, our kind of reluctant hero, Ted Stryker, Julie Haggerty as Elaine, who's just trying to keep it together amidst all this chaos. But gotta talk about, Leslie Nielsen as Dr. Rumack.
Oh, come on. Legendary.
Yeah. He steals every scene.
He really does.
Now, what's interesting about Nielsen, as the podcast points out, he actually had a background in more dramatic acting.
Right.
So seeing him deliver these just utterly ridiculous lines with a completely straight face, it's genius.
It's that contrast that makes it so funny.
There's that line, the podcast mentions it. It's a big building with patience, but that's not important right now.
Oh, my gosh.
And it's like, it sums up the whole movie.
It really does.
Yeah.
It's like their commitment to just keeping a straight face, even when things are the most absurd, is just perfect.
Like, imagine, even when passengers are like suddenly breaking out into a choreographed dance routine during this moment of panic.
Right.
It's played as if it's totally normal.
Yes. It's just another Tuesday.
And there are so many moments like that. The inflatable autopilot.
Yeah.
The announcer commenting that 30,000 feet is, a nice altitude.
Yeah.
Just one ridiculous thing after another.
And because they're so committed to that, to never breaking character and playing everything straight, Airplane creates this world where, logic just doesn't exist.
Doesn't apply.
Yeah. It's out the window. And because anything seems possible, the jokes just keep getting funnier and funnier.
I also love that this podcast pointed out that Airplane, it's not just about, the main characters.
Yeah.
It's full of these really memorable supporting characters.
For sure.
And they all add this layer of absurdity to the mix. Like Robert Stack as Captain Over, Peter Graves as Captain Clarence Over.
Classic.
And they all play their roles with such seriousness amidst the craziness.
It's so good.
And that contrast is what makes it so funny.
Yeah. And, we can't forget those iconic lines from Airplane that are just, ingrained in our everyday language.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Don't call me Shirley. I just want to tell you both good luck. We're all counting on you. These lines have, transcended the film itself.
Right. Those phrases delivered in that deadpan way, they've taken on a life of their own.
Yeah.
And they're so quotable.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm curious, what else did this podcast episode have to say? What's some behind-the-scenes stuff?
Oh, well, for starters, did you know that the movie was originally titled Flight into Danger?
What?
Yeah. Thank goodness they changed it to Airplane.
Flight into Danger doesn't quite have the same ring to it.
No, it does not. Airplane. It's just
way better.
Perfect.
Yeah. And get this. Leslie Nielsen actually ad-libbed that famous line, "I am serious and don't call me Shirley."
Really? It wasn't even in the script.
Not originally. The script just had, "Don't call me Shirley."
Wow.
But Nielsen, in a stroke of comedic genius, added the "I am serious" before.
I mean, what a legend.
Right. And it just elevates the humor even more, don't you think?
Absolutely. So this podcast, it also mentioned that Robert Hayes, who played Ted Stryker, actually had trouble keeping a straight face
Oh, yeah.
during filming, especially in those scenes with the inflatable autopilot.
I can only imagine, like, that must have been so hard.
Yeah, like the comedic timing of everybody is just so perfect.
It really is.
And it just shows that they really nailed it.
Yeah, it's brilliant. When even the actors are struggling to keep it together, you know it's good.
Oh, yeah.
So this podcast also highlights, Airplane was a massive box office hit.
Yeah.
Made over $83 million on a budget of only $3.5 million.
Wow.
That's pretty impressive.
That's a great return. It really shows its enduring appeal.
Yeah.
Airplane didn't just entertain, it really inspired this whole wave of spoof films.
Oh, for sure.
From the Naked Gun series to even the Scary Movie franchise.
Wow. So Airplane had like a pretty significant impact on comedy overall.
Oh, absolutely.
Like how so?
I mean, it really popularized the use of that deadpan delivery, rapid fire jokes.
Yeah.
Contrasting these serious situations with just completely absurd humor.
Yeah.
But it also showed that parodies that don't have to be mean-spirited.
Right, right.
Airplane proved that you can poke fun at things you love and still be incredibly clever and funny at the same time.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. This is making me want to go back and rewatch Airplane. But before I do that, I want to shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about the cultural impact of Airplane.
Right.
Because this podcast, it's making me think it wasn't just about the box office success, it was something bigger.
Absolutely.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think Airplane really tapped into a specific cultural moment, and it had an impact that went beyond just the big screen.
Okay.
But we'll get into that after a quick break. So Airplane, it really tapped into like a specific cultural moment. Remember, it was released in 1980.
Yeah.
It was just a few years after Watergate.
Right.
And, during a time when people were feeling pretty cynical about, authority figures.
Oh, yeah.
So you had this backdrop of like distrust and skepticism.
Right. So you're saying the film's humor was like reflecting what was actually happening in society.
Exactly. Like, think about it. You've got these pilots who are completely nonchalant about a plane full of passengers in danger, incompetent air traffic controllers, officials who are more concerned with like public image when actually solving problems.
Yeah.
It plays into that sense of distrust.
Totally. That was so prevalent.
Yeah, the podcast actually made a point of saying that.
Oh, really?
That Airplane wasn't just like a silly movie. It was like a clever satire of those anxieties.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so brilliant.
Yeah.
It managed to address these kind of serious issues in a way that was both funny and thought-provoking.
Yeah.
It gave people a way to like laugh at their fears.
Right.
Which can be incredibly cathartic.
So by like exaggerating those fears and poking fun at these authority figures, Airplane, kind of gave audiences this way to process them.
Precisely. And it did so in a way that was so clever and creative. Like, think about some of the film's most iconic jokes.
Yeah.
They often rely on like wordplay, visual gags, and subverting expectations.
Now that we're digging a little deeper.
And I'm realizing that I never really thought about like how clever the writing in Airplane is.
It's so sharp.
Yeah.
The Zucker brothers and Jim Abrahams.
Yeah.
They were masters of comedic timing and structure.
Yeah.
They understood that a joke, it's more than just a punchline.
Right.
It's about setting up expectations and then taking the audience in a completely unexpected direction.
Can you give me like an example?
Yeah, for sure.
Because I'm having trouble like picturing what you mean.
Think about the scene where Dr. Rumack is trying to calm down the passengers by asking if anyone knows how to fly a plane.
Right.
And then this little girl raises her hand and says, I can fly a plane.
Yeah.
You think it's going to be like this heartwarming moment where this child is going to save the day.
Right. Totally.
But then the camera zooms in on her face.
Yeah.
And she's wearing a pilot's hat and has a cigarette dangling from her mouth.
Oh, right. Yes. That's one of my favorites.
It's just that unexpected twist.
Yeah.
That just gets you every time.
Yeah. What about like visual gags though? Can you like break down how those work?
Well, visual gags are all about using visuals to create humor. And in Airplane, they're often used to like highlight the absurdity
Right.
of the situations.
Okay.
Like, remember the scene where Ted Stryker is having flashbacks to his time as a fighter pilot?
Oh, of course. Yeah, he's like flashing back to that dramatic wartime experience.
Right, but instead of showing us, like, a typical war scene,
Right.
they cut to a flashback of Stryker playing a game of basketball.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And to make it even funnier, he's wearing his military uniform while playing.
Right. It's just so, like, unexpected. It doesn't make any sense.
They're so random, and it's just
I think
hilarious.
this is making you realize Airplane, it's so much more
Oh, yeah.
than just a silly movie, like, full of quotable lines.
Totally.
It's like a really smart and sophisticated comedy,
Yes.
and it deserves to be analyzed and appreciated
You really does.
for its craft. What else did the podcast highlight about the film's techniques?
Well, the podcast, it actually spends a good amount of time breaking down the way the film uses deadpan delivery
Oh, yeah.
to enhance the humor.
Okay, so I've always loved deadpan, but
Yeah.
I never really thought about, like, how it works.
Right. It's not just about, like, the actors saying funny lines.
Yeah.
It's about the way they say them.
Okay. Can you explain it, like, a little more?
Yeah. So it's all about delivering those absurd lines with a completely serious expression.
Okay.
Like, the actors never let on that they're in on the joke.
Right.
And that contrast between, like, the ridiculousness of the situation
Yeah.
and the straight-faced delivery just makes the humor even funnier.
So it's almost like the actors are, like, playing it straight even when the script is anything but.
Exactly. And it's that commitment to the bit that really sells the humor.
Yeah.
You know, like, the audience is left to figure out for themselves that what they're seeing is supposed to be funny.
It's funny. I think most people associate Airplane with its, like, over-the-top humor and crazy situations. But this deep dive is making me appreciate just how carefully crafted, like, the jokes are.
Yes.
And how much thought went into, like, using those comedic techniques.
Totally. And what's even more impressive
Yeah.
is that Airplane managed to achieve all of this while still being a really entertaining movie.
Yeah. It's not pretentious or anything.
Right. It never feels like it's trying too hard to be, like, clever or intellectual.
And it's so watchable. Like, you pick up on new things every time you see it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There are so many layers to the humor
Right.
that you can watch it multiple times
Yeah.
and still find something new to laugh at.
But,
But, you know, we should probably move on.
okay.
We haven't even talked about Airplane lasting legacy
Right. The legacy.
and its influence on other films.
Okay, let's talk legacy. What did this podcast episode have to say about that?
Well, it made a really interesting point. It argued that while Airplane was a parody of disaster movies,
Right.
its influence kind of extended far beyond that genre.
Really? How so?
Well, the podcast pointed out that Airplane success really opened the doors for this whole new wave
Oh, wow.
of spoof movies. It showed studios that audiences were hungry for this type of humor.
So you're saying Airplane paved the way for other movies,
Yeah.
like The Naked Gun,
Exactly.
Scary Movie.
Yep. Those films took the blueprint laid out by Airplane.
Yeah.
The rapid-fire jokes, the deadpan delivery,
Right.
the willingness to be completely absurd,
Yeah.
and applied it to different genres.
So it's like Airplane created, like, a whole new comedic language that other filmmakers could then use and adapt.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about, like, the specific jokes or techniques.
Yeah.
Airplane
Yeah.
also demonstrated that parody.
Yeah.
It could be both funny and intelligent.
Right. It proved you could make a movie that was both, like, a loving homage
Yeah.
and a sharp satire.
Exactly.
That's a great point. I think a lot of people assume that parody has to be, like, lowbrow or mean-spirited. But Airplane showed
Yeah.
that it can be so much more than that. But we got to wrap up soon.
Okay.
What was, like, the main takeaway
Yeah.
from this podcast episode?
Well, the podcast ended by asking a really interesting question.
Okay.
If Airplane was so successful at parodying disaster movies of its time,
Right.
what modern-day genre would be ripe for, like, a similar comedic treatment today?
Ooh.
What tropes and cliches could be hilariously exaggerated?
That is a really interesting question. It's making me think about all the genres we have today
I know.
that could be ripe for that kind of, like, comedic deconstruction.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I think there are a lot of possibilities. Maybe, like, the superhero genre
Okay.
with its over-the-top action sequences
Right.
and, like, brooding heroes.
Right.
It could use a good dose of, like, Airplane-style absurdity.
Ooh. I like that. What about, like, those reality TV dating shows with
Yeah.
all the, like, manufactured drama and,
Sure.
like, carefully constructed persona?
The possibilities are endless. It's a challenge we leave to you, dear listener. what modern-day genre would you like to see
Yeah.
get the airplane treatment?
That is a really interesting question to think about. Now, before we go, I want to touch on one more thing that this podcast you sent in brought up. It argues that Airplane wasn't just making fun of disaster movies, it was actually tapping into some deeper
Oh,
anxieties
yeah.
that people were feeling at the time.
That's such a good point.
Like,
Yeah.
remember, this was 1980.
Right.
A lot of concerns about air travel
Yeah.
technology,
Right.
even the competence of, people in authority.
Oh, for sure.
So the movie was like reflecting those real world fears.
Exactly. And by like exaggerating those fears to this ridiculous degree,
Right.
Airplane, it allowed audiences to laugh at them and maybe even process them a little bit.
So it was like a form of comedic therapy?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
It gave people permission to like acknowledge those anxieties and find humor in them.
Yeah.
And sometimes laughter is the best way to cope with like stressful situations.
Totally.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, this deep dive has been so much fun.
Yeah.
Thanks to you for sharing this podcast episode.
Of course.
It gave us a whole new perspective on Airplane.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to see how like fans engage with classic films and uncover these like new layers of meaning.
Before we wrap up, I gotta ask, what do you think a modern day Airplane would look like? Like, what anxieties would it target? What genre would it spoof?
Ooh, that's a great question. Maybe it would be like a parody of those like tech-obsessed dystopian movies
Yeah.
that are so popular these days.
Yeah.
We could have like self-driving cars going haywire,
Right.
social media influencers taking over the world,
Oh,
and everyone's just glued to their like virtual reality headsets while the real world is falling apart around them.
that's hilarious.
Right.
I can already picture the over-the-top visuals, the deadpan dialogue.
Right.
It would be a perfect blend of like social commentary and
That's right.
absurd humor.
Exactly. It would be a way to like hold up a mirror to our current society
Yeah.
and poke fun at all of our like obsessions and anxieties.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into Airplane.
Oh.
We had a blast dissecting this comedic masterpiece, and we hope you did too.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.
And remember, if you have any sources, articles,
Yeah.
podcast episodes
Host.
that you'd like us to explore in a future deep dive,
Send them our way.
send them our way. We are always up for a challenge.
Always.
Until next time, keep laughing, keep learning,
Oh.
and remember,
What's the line?
don't call us Shirley.
That's the one.